perhaps I would like to share something on experimental economics. So my research areas, I've done a lot of experiments. Most of experiments that I've done so far are lab experiments, not field experiment. I have very little experience in doing field experiments, but I have done a lot lab experiments. Doing lab experiments, of course, is much simpler than doing field experiments, because what I need to do is a computer lab and subjects. So my subjects are usually students. And in NTU, it's not that difficult to find students as subjects. Okay? But even though we are talking about lab experiments and field experiments share many similarities in terms of the basic principles of running experiments. So what I'm going to do today is just to share with you what I think we should do when we run experiments, and why do we need to run experiments. Okay? Now the difference between experiment and survey, as you all know, in survey we are talking about stated preferences. We ask them what they think they would do, but we don't know whether they will actually do that when they are facing that decisions in life. Okay? So experiments is the opposite. We are approaching it from revealed preferences. Okay? So we want to understand the underlying motivations behind certain actions by observing whatever choices that they do in the experiments. Okay? Then using observations from the experiment, we are trying to find out. So that the approach is the opposite. Okay? So that's the principle of experiment. Now let's talk about experimental economics. So what is experimental economics? So it's now a field in economics, and it's been growing. So we have associations. It's called Economic Science Associations, ESA. And one time there was Asia Pacific Economic Science Association that was held in Taipei at the National Taiwan University. So it was last year, I think. It was ESA, Asia Pacific meeting. Okay. So what is experimental economics? So to me, the way I define experimental economics is the field of economics that aims to create an environment under which we have controlled conditions. And these conditions resemble a natural or economic environment where theories, whatever theories we are talking about, are postulated to work. If you are economic theories, you build models. You solve your models using mathematics, you get your solutions, and you get your theoretical predictions. In building the models, you impose assumptions. Assumptions may be quite limiting, but they are needed to simplify the whole analysis. Now the question is, how do we test the theoretical predictions? One way of testing it is using empirical analysis, using regressions, but we need to get the data. So how do we get the data? We search the data source, could be primary data, could be secondary data. Then we use the data and we run regression, whatever techniques we use, and we conclude from that kind of analysis. But there will be some drawbacks. What will be the drawbacks? Because we are not sure whether or not the data is generated in the same kind of environments that the theories are postulated to work. Okay? Whether this is exactly the same thing. So there are many other factors that play a role that generate that data. So in the language of experimental economics, we talk about confounding factors. So all of these factors that shape the data, and if you use that data, we need to do a lot of things like controlling things, controlling for this, controlling for that in your empirical analysis. Because that's what we do usually in empirical analysis. In experiment, the approach is different. We generate the data ourselves. How do we generate the data ourselves? By creating the environments that resembles what we explained in the theory and let people make decisions in that kind of environment. So we get the data from whatever decision they make, then we use that and then run regression and run analysis. So that's the approach what we do in experimental analysis, experimental economics. Okay? So Ferdinand Smith is of course the founder of experimental economics. He got the Nobels together with Daniel Kahneman. But Kahneman is more for behavioral economics and Ferdinand Smith is for experimental economics. So he said, an untested theory is simply a hypothesis. As such, it is part of our self-knowledge. So science seeks to expand our knowledge of things by a process of testing this type of self-knowledge. That's why we need empirical testing. Now, when you do empirical testing and you're talking about the impact of a certain policy, we call it with the term treatment, you are interested in comparing the outcomes with the treatments, Y1, with the outcomes without treatment. Okay? So you look for the treatment effect for unit I, observation I. That will be the difference between after the treatments, with treatment and without treatment. Okay? Now there is a problem here. So what is the problem that we face here? The problem is the outcomes, whatever the outcomes you are looking at, Y, for a treated unit I, we do not know the counterfactuals. So what if there had not been any treatment? What would happen if that unit of observation I did not receive treatment? So the counterfactual is not there because the fact is that this unit observation I receives treatment. So we would not know how would this unit observation I behave had it not been there any treatment at all. Because you cannot be two persons at once. Even twins, they are not really behaving in the same way. Okay? So this is a problem. So how do we solve that problem? So there are many ways. And one thing that I do is mostly controlled experiments. So what we do, we compare the results that we obtain from what we call treated sample with the control, the baseline or untreated sample. That must be identical, quote unquote, except one aspect that is being investigated, the treatment. So it's similar like you do comparative statics analysis of an equilibrium. So you're looking at what happened all else equal when there is one thing that changed. So what happens to that equilibrium? So it's almost like a comparative statics analysis. So in this case, you compare control and treated. All else, everything's identical except the presence of treatment. Okay, so that's what we want to do. That is being investigated, the treatment. So how do we do that? For that, we need to have a very good randomizations. So we need to randomize subjects into treatments. And this is a very important aspect of experiments. Okay? So then, with that, we are interested in looking at the average treatment effect. So we are looking at the average, not any particular individual, but we are looking at the average. So that is the difference between with treatment and without treatment on average. Okay? So another way of doing it, not using control experiments. Control experiment, we have all the control we created in the lab or in the field. Another way of doing it is through natural experiments. Jack mentioned a bit about natural experiment. So what is it, natural experiment? So natural experiment is basically we consider the treatment itself whatever the treatment we are looking at, maybe policy, government policy. So the government policy, when it was implemented, at the back of government's mind, it was not an experiment that they want to do. But it's just that policy is implemented. So natural experiment is basically we consider that treatment itself, that's government policy, as an experiment. Okay? So we try to find this kind of naturally occurring comparison group to mimic the control group. Okay? So what we do, so I think many of you are familiar with this, we use difference in difference. Okay? So what do we measure? We measure the difference in treated group after and before, and compare that to the difference in control group after and before. Okay? So we thus have something like this. So y it is outcome at time t, and this x it is a factor of control variables, and that is an important element. That's the treatment dummy variables, depending on what treatments we have. So that's the treatment dummy, and these are the error terms. So we are interested in looking at difference in difference between the treated and the untreated group, before and after. Okay? So now, what if the counterfactuals, or whatever, not the counterfactual, but what if the control, there is a problem of selections. Selection into the treatment, like policy, government policy, ideally it has to be, in a way, selections to that treatment is random. But in real world, it's very difficult to get that. Okay? Sometimes the approach that people use, there is a technique that they use, there is a propensity score matching. So when selection into treatment is an issue, so people use propensity score matching. So what they do, they transform non-experimental data into something like experimental data. So steps involved. Usually they use logit probit model to estimate the probability of treated, and then use matching algorithms. Stata gave that. Stata has this kind of module to construct counterfactuals for each treatment observations. Basically, you are asking what would happen to the observation had it not been receiving treatment. Of course, this counterfactual is unobservable, so that's why you need to estimate this. Okay? So then you calculate the average treatment effect. So there's one way of doing that. Now, there are many ways. So what I do, usually I do lab experiments. Okay? You can do also field experiments. Some example of behavioral nudges that I have shown you, those are done in the field. So when we talk about field experiment, there are two types of field experiment. One is bringing labs to the field. So you do exactly the same that you would want to do in the lab, but you just do it in the field with the subject, non-student subjects. But another, which is I think more challenging and better, is really do field experiments, not just bringing all kind of activity that people usually do in the lab to the field. Okay? So why do we do? What is the goals of experiment? Why do you do experiments? What would be the goal? What is supposed to be the correct way of looking at experiment? What do you think? There are many different approaches of running experiments. You'll see people do experiments because they want to test theories. So that's one of the common goal of running experiment. So that's why in game theory, there are many papers in game theory looking at and running experiments to test the theories. Okay? So basically testing the empirical scope and content of theories. So often formal theories where the setting underlying the theories are often hard to observe outside the lab. A good example would be public goods game. So it has a lot of applications in environmental economics as well. Where in a lab experiment, typically what you will do, you invite participants to come to the lab, you divide them into groups, say group of 4, group of 5. Okay, and then you gave them endowments. So endowments in terms of points or in terms of experimental currency units, and give them choice. You can contribute to the public fund, or you can not contribute and take away the endowment for your own, yourself, your private fund. For every 1 unit of contributions to the public fund, everyone stands to get the benefit. So for example, you define this benefit in the experiment literature, it's called the marginal MCRP. I forgot what is the stand for. So for every 1 unit in the public fund, regardless of who contributed, you get 50 cents. But if you put your 1 unit into your own pocket, you get 1 unit. So this is like a public goods, because if everyone contributes, the more money in the public fund, everyone will get the benefits. Okay? So collectively, the first best outcome if everyone contribute, just like in public goods. If everyone chip in providing the public goods, that's the best for the community, for the society. But game theory tells us that individual will have an incentive to deviate, because I would think, why should I contribute? Let others contribute. I get the benefit from the public fund. I take away the money. I put the money into my pocket. So that's better. I get more money. In game theory, everyone is rational. Everyone would expect the same thing. Everyone would exactly do the same thing. Then what we have, the Nash equilibrium of this public good, linear public good game, would be no one contribute. That comes, the prediction comes from the theory. We all know this is the theory. Then the question here, is it true if we run this? No matter what kind of framing you use. You might want to use the frame as, suppose imagine you are villagers, you want to contribute building the bridge. You need to decide how much money you want to contribute. Whatever you don't contribute is for you. So if you want to test the predictions, you run an experiment. Okay? So you group them into group 4 or 5. The group size depends. So that's also a question, whether you will have more cooperations with a larger group or with a smaller group. So that's another thing. Suppose that you run the experiment in the lab. So you find the data, the amount that each individual contributed to the public fund, and you calculate the average, and you find out whether it is actually significantly different from 0 or not, as predicted by the theory. Okay, so that's the way we use experiments to test theory. So there are many others, like auctions. Yesterday I was talking with someone of you between comparing of allocating resources or units using posted offer markets, where everyone sees the price, or using auctions, where you let them bid. Which one is more optimal? Presumably you can build a theory and you solve the models, you can come up with the predictions. The way you test the prediction is through the experiment, okay, by running experiment in the lab. So there are many examples of this. That's the first type. The second, and this is coming from psychology. In most of psychology experiments, they are not motivated by any theory to begin with. They're not testing theories, my view. Okay? What they are interested in is finding interesting observations. Let's run this experiment, see what can come out from this experiment. Okay? Is there anything useful come up from this experiment? Is there any nice observation that come up? Like, for example, the study that Jack mentioned about ice cream cup. The big one, but the small content, little content, but the small cup, but with overflowing ice cream. Okay? So that's, I think, to me, I think the initial intuitions is coming from, oh, let's run this, see what happens. Okay? And look at the data, the result, and what kind of interesting aspect we can get from this experiment. So this is a different approach. So economics tend to use the first one, testing theory, because they're always so preoccupied with testing theories. I need to test the theory, I need to do this, whether this can be validated or not. But others, sometimes don't care about the theories to begin with. They just care about what kind of nice observation we can get. So that is searching for facts. So we explore empirical regularities where no theoretical prediction exists. Hopefully, using the result, using observation that we have, we can construct a theory. We can build a theory. In fact, prospect theory is developed in this way. In expected utility theorem, the developments, they come from all these axiomatizations approach. Very theoretical. Prospect theory is not. Understandable because Kahneman is not an economist. He's a psychologist. Okay? So that's why what they did, run experiments. First thing first, run experiments. Let's run experiment. Let's see what happens. They discover that people behave differently towards gains and losses. Well, this is not according to the expected utility theorem. It needs a new theory. So what is that new theory? They come up with prospect theory. Oh, maybe there is domains of gains, there is domains of losses. In domains of gains, people have concave value functions. In the domains of losses, people have convex value functions. So that is in this category. I think this is also useful. But sometimes economists somehow too much preoccupied with testing theories. It becomes too restrictive, I think. This one, I think, is also an interesting way of looking. The third one, we run experiments because we want to be relevant for policymakers and being able to provide reliable advice. So for example, in the example of primary school leaving examination I mentioned, whether or not we should provide comparisons, peer comparisons, whether it is good or not, that is a policy motivated. It's not that our curiosity out of the blue, but, oh, I want to know, should I implement this? Or maybe in the example of paying teachers with money, whether paying upfront or paying later. So that's a nice policy that you want to test. All the example of the nudges, behavioral nudges that I mentioned earlier in the morning, these are motivation. Let's see if we have those policies, what can we get from those policies? Okay? So this is the third one, being relevant for policymakers and being able to provide reliable advice. So which one is useful? I think all of them are useful, depending on what topic of interest research that you find it interesting. Now, there are two prominent figures. In behavioral economics, you have Daniel Kahneman, and you have Richard Taylor, and Amos Tversky. Amos Tversky, you probably would have gotten the Nobel Prize had he not passed away earlier. But in experiments, you also have two Nobel Prize winners. The first one is Ferdinand Smith. He's still alive. Reynald Selton has died several years ago. So he pioneered the use of laboratory experiment as a tool in empirical economics analysis. In particular, market experiments. Imagine a market for an assets, stocks, and you have traders endowed with assets and cash, or just any kind of markets, and want to see whether people can actually reach an equilibrium or not. We learn from microeconomics, supply and demand. That's the intersection, that's the equilibrium. Can people really find out that or not? So that's where all these market experiments is. Okay, so that's Ferdinand Smith. Then there is a Reynald Selton, so pioneers in the use of laboratory experiments in game theory. Okay, so these are the two. Now, what do we need when we want to run experiment? So what are those basic elements of a lab experiment? I'm talking about lab experiment most of the time. First, we need to detail all the necessary ingredients. So we need to describe the subject endowments, costs, and also the institutions underlying the experiments must be stipulated in the experimental instruction. So there was this very nice paper published in Quarterly Journal of Economics. So it's something relevant for environmental economics as well. So the question is, which kind of allocation mechanism is better in encouraging people incentive to do socially responsible activities? Is it central planning or is it market? Which one is better? That's a question which has a long tradition. Okay, in that experiment, what they do, they create a market for a product, so they assign subjects into firms and consumers, buyers. So firms have the decision to make what product to produce. So there are two options available to firms. One is producing clean product that has no negative externality on consumers. And the other option is producing unclean product that has negative externality on consumers. Okay? Producing clean product is costly. There is a cost imposed on the firm to produce that. So hence the price charged must be also higher. Okay? Then that's what the firm do, deciding which product to produce. Consumers are played by other subjects. Their decision is just to decide which product they want to consume, to buy, clean or these others, the other product with externality. From the consumer point of view, the value gained from each product is the same. So consumer is going to be indifferent between clean or unclean product, because the satisfaction or the value that they get is the same. But they have to choose. And there is a third group of participants played third parties, society. So whenever consumers decide to purchase environmentally unfriendly good, the third parties experience losses in terms of endowments. So that's to simulate negative externalities. So all of these details need numbers. So in experiments, what we do, we assign these values, endowments, to all of these participants. The cost to firms, for example, the value for the consumers, whatever the surplus they can get, and the amount of externality inflicted on the third party. So this is what I mean by all these details of endowment costs and also the institution underlying the experiment. So that's the market that we try to simulate in the experiment. So all of this have to be spelled out in the experimental instructions. So in addition to the step-by-step procedures. So make sure that subjects know exactly what they have to do. So they all have common information. You know, if I have different information than the others, my behavior is influenced by this different information. So how do we impose this common knowledge, public knowledge? For that, in experiment, we usually read the instruction out loud. So in a field as well, so if you want to run field experiment, it's best to actually read the instruction out loud so everyone listen here from the same source. So there is uniformity in terms of the instruction. So then must decide how much information you want to give to subjects. Okay? So, and all these things. So these are the details that you need to do when you run the experiment. Then you need to decide what treatments, variations you want to do. So in the example of the behavioral nudges, we have real-time information control, and we have real-time information and goals. So these are the treatment variation. So how many treatments you want to run, depending on the questions that you want to address. Okay? So in the example of energy labels, there are many different labels there. So you might want to see the impact of all of those labels, and you might run a separate treatment for each label, see how people behave towards that label. Okay? Now, randomization of subjects into treatment is essential. So this must be done properly to eliminate selection bias into treatments. Okay? So all of this is important. So this is about randomizations. So what do we next? What do we do next? So we look at the causal effect. So experiment is basically to identify the causal effect of the treatment X on Y and this is going to be captured by that thing, something that I mentioned earlier. So we need to properly control for the confounding factors. So all other things that might influence the result. Okay, so when we do, this is what I usually do. So there are two treatments, treatments A and B. That's treatment A, that's treatment B. So this treatment A, this treatment B, there's a group of subjects, this is a group of subjects. The difference is that there is that treatment. Okay, so this is the outcome of that treatment. This is the outcome of that treatment. So this group receive A, this group receive B, and that's the outcome after receiving A, and that's the outcome after receiving B. So if you look at this allocations to treatment, they are all identical. Randomization is important here, but the difference is that there is this treatment here, but not here. Okay, and that's the outcome. So you compare these two outcomes with treatments and without treatment. That you do when you do experiment. So the way you look at it is like, for example, this is an example of public goods game, the one that I described earlier, where everyone has to contribute. So the question is, do we see cooperations, people contribute? Now, then the next question is, can we increase contributions where people will be willing to contribute more? Can we increase that by punishing low contributions? So in the village or in the community, that would mean, so let everybody contribute voluntarily. Then after everybody contribute, find out who contribute the least and punish that person. Can that be better than no punishment in terms of encouraging people to contribute? So that's a kind of question that we want to do. So next, would it be better if we communicate to all subjects whatever contribution that have been made? Tell them, A contribute this much, B contribute that much. So communication. So that is with and without. With communication and without communication, will communications improve collaboration, cooperations or not? With punishment, without punishment. So in the jargon of experiments, we are dealing with 2x2 variations. The first variation is with communication, without communications. The second variation is with punishment and without punishment. So you have 2x2, 4 treatments. One is, suppose that this is your control. This is your baseline. In the baseline, nothing. No communications, no punishment. That's your baseline. Then you can compare. You can compare these two, treatment control and treatment P. They're all the same, having no communications. So the only difference is punishment. So comparing this allows you to evaluate the impact of punishment. Comparing C and PC allow you to evaluate the impact of punishment as well. But the difference is these two are under the conditions that communication exists. So if you look at, compare this without this impact, the difference between this and the difference between this, you are looking at whether punishments has a different impact in with and without communication. Okay? So you can also compare between treatment control and treatment C. So here, the same conditions, no punishment. But you are only looking at the impact of communications. So you are looking whether communication actually improve in an environment where there is no punishment. Same thing also here. You are looking at the impact of communications without and with communications in an environment where there is a punishment. If you compare this and that, you get the difference in impact of communications in an environment with punishment and without punishment. So that's the way you run experiment, usually treatment variations. So any kind of treatment variation that you have, what is the dimensions, 2x2, 2x3, depending on what you want to study. Okay? So when you run experiment, also in the field, there are two options you can choose. One is something that we call between subject design. So there's a between subject design, and the other one is within subject design. So between subject design means that every subject only do one treatment. So in the example of punishment, so I only do punishment treatments, others do other treatment. Okay? So in this, different subjects observe in different treatment, thus each subject only participate in one treatment. One group of subjects would serve as a control group. So that's between subject. Sometimes running experiments need money, and it can cost a lot. So if you run between subject treatments, because everybody must do only one treatment, you need to have a lot of subjects, participants. So sometimes when budget is an issue, when you don't have a lot of money to run full experiment between subjects, you do within subjects design. That is, let each individual do 2 treatments or 3 treatments at the same time. Okay? So that is within subject. Single subject observe in different treatments. So a subject participate in different treatments. One subgroup of subjects would serve as a control group. Okay? So there is a pro and cons. Between subjects may be better. You avoid behavioral spillover effect. But the con is you require many subjects and it could be costly when you run this experiment. This one, less costly, but then my behavior when I face punishment treatment depends also on my behavior I display earlier when I play communication treatment, because I do several treatments. So it matters which order I do first, punishment first or communication first. So that's why in the experiment, when you run field experiment or lab experiment, you need to randomize the order. Okay, so that's what we do when we run experiment. So this is the description, within subject and between subject. So this is between subjects, condition A and condition B. And within subjects is basically both of them do both conditions. Okay. So what are the other design issues? And I'm almost there. My goal here is just to introduce you experimental literature, how to conduct the experiments. If you want to know more, feel free to ask me. I'll be very happy to give some tips on running experiments, either in the lab or in the field. And I think this could be useful as an alternative of those things that you have usually done, the stated preferences approach. Okay? To me, revealed preferences approach is the way I usually do. Maybe for some others, stated preferences approach are the alternative option that people might choose. Okay? So other design issue. Do we need to observe several rounds of decisions? Or we let them play only once? We let them do the experiments once, one round only. Should we repeat the rounds? Let's see how do they behave over and over again. To me, I think when you run experiment, I want to observe whether there is a learning or not. So what I do, I run multiple rounds of the same experiments. Okay? So I'll see the development of the behaviors. Is there any learning observed there or not? Okay? So the number of rounds will be useful when you want to evaluate whether there is learning or not. So more rounds would allow subjects to learn over time. Okay? So some experimental research shows that, in public goods especially, in voluntary contribution game, when you run public goods experiment in the lab, typically at the beginning, contribution is high, around 40% of the endowment. Sometimes it's even higher. But when you run many rounds, in the end, the contribution is going to decay. Never goes to zero as predicted by the theory, but it's not really that. Sometimes it's quite close to zero, maybe 20% of the endowment. There are still contributions. There's a deviation from the theory, but it's not as high as at the beginning because there's a learning process. So that's what you need to take care as well. Then, if you do multiple run And if the experiment is not in the form of individual decision making, suppose in the public goods, the group consists of 5 members, and you run many rounds. Would you want to keep with the same group members, or would you want to randomly assign them groups? So each round, they have different group compositions. So this may not matter, but theoretically this is important, because if you play with the same members every time, you basically have a repeated game. So game theory tells us that if you know that there is n point terminations, you will never be able to sustain any contribution so you will have 0 contribution. If you randomly rematch them, so you have repetition of one-shot interactions. So that's something that you might want to do. So that's partner matching and stranger matching. So payment, and this is important in light of the study on the willingness to pay. So in economic experiments, we pay subjects. In psychology experiments, we do not pay subjects. So how do they encourage people to participate in psychology experiments? When they do a psychology experiment in the lab, they ask students to come, and if they come, they get credit points for their course. So they get some grade for participating in the experiment. They never pay subjects. But economic experiments always pay subjects. Why? Because economists think that people react to incentive. So you need to see how incentive change behavior. You need to pay them. So that's monetary payment is an important part of experiment. So with payments, it makes it the case that the decision is important because it will influence how much money you earn from the experiment. So that's also the reasons why in the willingness to pay elicitations that I showed in one of the study, whatever they decide will matter for the amount of money they will take back. Okay, so if they took the options of home energy report plus $5, foregoing the $10 money, so basically these persons get only $5 instead of $10. Okay, so that's the amount of money that the person has to sacrifice. That's why the willingness to sacrifice is one concept that Jack mentions, but that's an essential feature of revealed preference experiments, because you need to make sure that they bear the consequences of whatever action they do. So that's what we do. So that's about the payment for the participants. Now, the next one, so when you run a public goods experiment, do you give them a reference frame, giving them a scenario? For example, imagine that you are a villager. You are together with other villagers, 5 of you or 6 of you, are deciding to build a bridge that will benefit everybody, all group members, all 5 of you. So you need to decide how much money you want to contribute, and whatever you don't contribute, it's for your own taking. That using scenario. I put a reference, village, community, contribution, building a bridge. But you might also strip all of this attribute. You just simply say you are running interactive experiment in a group. You are given endowments. What you need to do is to decide how much part of your endowments you want to put it in this account, and the rest will be put in your own account. Okay? So that's basically with neutral languages. So the question is, do you provide them the scenario, or do you provide them neutral languages? Okay? So depending on the experiment, some experiments you need to provide them neutral languages, some experiments you need to give context. Because after all, you are trying to understand something about the context. Okay? Now, so the last part is critiques on experiments. Can you come up with any critiques on experiments? Why we should not do experiments? Yesterday I was talking to one of you, and there is one important point that was raised there. That is external validity. When you run experiment, you are only running with a small subset of subjects. So either students, there are only small group of students, or even in the field, you are only dealing with a limited number of participants. So the question is, are you sure that behaviors exhibited in the experiments would mimic the behavior that you would observe in the real world? So that's the issue of external validity. But I think this issue of external validity also the same problem that you face when you do a survey. Same thing. Is there any external validity of your survey? That's the same questions. To me, that's the same questions that we have also in the experiment. Because decision makers in the real world are more sophisticated than subject, often students in the lab. Okay? So institutional and market settings underlying the environment where decision makers in the real world make decisions are more complex than the artificial environment created in the lab. Okay? So how to respond to these questions? So nowadays it's not that difficult to publish experimental papers, but 10 years ago it was quite difficult to publish because people are always asking about external validity. Now no referee asks about external validity anymore. So the defense is subjects in the lab are also real subjects. They make real money. For testing theory, it is less relevant. After all, the theories also relies on abstraction and simplifications. Okay? So the experiment is to recreate the settings under this abstraction and simplifications. And the lab is just an approximation of reality. The experimental design can embed some degree of realism. Or if you want, you replicate it in some other study. That is the last issue I want to discuss. Another criticism is, well, I run these experiments with this group of subjects, but it doesn't mean that if I run in, say, I run in Singapore and I run in Taiwan, the result doesn't mean that the result has to be consistent with whatever result I get in Singapore. So there is an issue of replicability. Can we replicate these experiments? Can we get the same result as what we get in Singapore? Is that an important issue? In psychology, that's an important issue. There is a whole literature published in Science and Nature about replicability of psychology experiments. In economics also, that's an issue. Okay? So the ability to replicate the result is important. So must have standardized procedures, methods, and environments, and written clear experimental instructions, and so on. All of these things need to be documented so that other group of researchers can do exactly the same experiment using the same methodology, using the same procedures. So that's why in all papers published, experimental papers, you will always have experimental instructions detailing all the things that you do. So the idea is that if I read that and I want to replicate, I want to run the same study, I follow exactly the same procedure. Okay? Then I can say whether the result is replicable or not replicable. So there is, finally, just to close my talk, there is this very nice paper. This is published in Science. It's by Colin Kammerer from California Institute of Technology, with many, a whole bunch of co-authors, many. So the title is Evaluating Replicability of Laboratory Experiments in Economics. So what they did, they replicate 18 experimental studies published in the top journals AER and QJE in the period of 2011 to 2014. Guess what? Out of these 18, how many of them are replicated? Using different subject pool, different places for running the experiment. but the same protocol, the same procedure. Guess what? What is the success rate in economics? No, more optimistic than that. Actually, 11 out of 18 are replicable. So they are replicable, but another question is the size effect. That's another issue. They are replicable, 11 out of 18 are replicable, but on average, the replicated effect size is much smaller. So not really much, but smaller, definitely. 66% of the original effect. Okay? So, although it seems to be not quite an issue in economics, replicability is always an issue for experiments. So that's why some people think that that's non-replicability because of culture. Different culture play a role. Maybe if you run in the Western world and you run in the Asian context and Western context for exactly the same experiments, you might get different results because cultures matters, which I believe so. So cultural elements would be very important in driving the result. So that's why it would be very interesting. I think it's still quite interesting. All of those behavioral nudges that I show you, the one that was done in Singapore, the one that was done in Zurich, in a way should be done like that. So basically we need to replicate it in a different environment, different context, see whether the result is robust or not. If it is not robust, what are the elements that cause things that are not robust? Okay? So there's a brief overview of what experiments, something that I can share from my experience running lab experiments. Thank you.
It's on, right? Yeah. I'm going to try to do a couple of things here in the half hour or so we have. One is we did a study on surveys. I referred to it a little bit before. I want to talk about that, but first of all, talk a little bit about experiments, sort of supplement things that Echo was talking about. In terms of problems and the uses of experiments. I've run a bunch of experiments as well, probably not as many as Echo has, but in the beginning, that's what we did was experiments. Economic experiments are, in a sense, harder to do than experiments in other fields. My first degree is in soil science, and I work for the soils department, and I got involved in an awful lot of experiments. In fact, the stuff I learned running experiments in soil science was very helpful when I moved into behavioral economics. But those are simple kinds of experiments. When we talked about field experiments, we meant going out there in the field where the dirt is and stuff like that. That was a field experiment for us. Our experiments were very simple in a sense. Treatment A, treatment B, no fertilizer, for example. And we watched the crops grow. And we harvested them, weighed it, see if there was a difference. Very simple experiment. And, the problem of replication and so forth and so on, much easier. When you're dealing with people, a lot harder. So, it's much more complicated. Or medical experiments. The guy I work with in Thailand has a good friend who is a medical researcher Kunkan University's hospital, which has a very good medical faculty. And his friend does a lot of research, and one day they play tennis together a lot. And he was saying that the day before he had sent in 15 submissions to different journals of papers. He had written 15 papers and was sending them off in one day. And boom, my friend, what? 15 papers at once? But he explained, yeah, their papers are very, very simple. They're basically saying, I ran this experiment. One group of people I didn't do anything to, and I saw whether they were sick or not at the end of the month. The other people I gave blue pills to and checked how many people were sick at the end of the month. The third group I had white pills to, and at the end of the month I counted it. That was my paper. 3 treatments, this is what I did, this is the result, send it in. That's the paper. Well, we can't get away with that. I mean, we ought to try, though, this is the treatment, this is what happened, boom. But our stuff has to be much more complicated than that. Economic experiments, just sort of gossip history or whatever you want to call it. Vernon Smith claims that he was prompted to run experiments because of the experiments that were run by Edward Hastings Chamberlain of monopolistic competition, the guy, that was his whole life, was monopolistic competition. Well, he taught theory at Harvard, and at the beginning of his theory course, he got this is a PhD course at Harvard, he got everybody in the room to run an experiment. And what he was trying to teach people how markets work. So what he did was give everybody a piece of paper. Half of them had a big S on it, half of them had a big B on it with a number. The S's were sellers, the B's were buyers. The number was the reservation price. So what he said was, okay, and he explained what to do. Now get up and make deals, if you can. So people took I took the same course, and I did the same thing a few years after Vernon was there. So we all got up and wandered around, This is why I came to Harvard, was to do this. Anyway, so I had whatever it was, an S14. That means I could pay up to $14. So I looked around for somebody that I could make a deal with. And if I struck a deal, I ran up to the front, told him that we made a deal, he would write the price on the blackboard. So that was he was trying to teach us how markets work. And actually it was a very, very effective lesson, because you really learned how markets work. No one knew your reservation price except you, because you were the only one that could see this piece of paper. And he said, some of you are going to make deals, some of you are not going to make deals. So he used that to teach us about markets. Well, Vernon picked up on that and basically started running experiments more or less the same way. And one of the things that so-called experimental economists do that so-called behavioral economists tend not to do is to use induced values. What that means is, when Chamberlain wrote on my piece of paper, B14, he was telling me that's my reservation price. I didn't come up with a reservation price, he did. So he told me that's the value of this asset. If you have this asset, that's its value. That's called an induced value. And then you run all kinds of experiments doing this. How effective is, for example, different kinds of markets, auctions or whatever. So he gives out pieces of paper to people. This is the value that you have. Now see if you can make a deal or trade. In behavioral stuff, I started off with running markets where I gave people mugs. Half the people got a mug, and half the people didn't have a mug. Now, you want to buy a mug? See if you can find somebody that'll sell you a mug at a price that you are willing to pay. I was interested in how buyers valued the mug and how sellers valued the mug. I didn't tell them what the value of the mug was. It was them. If they liked the mug or they didn't like the mug, whether they were willing to pay a lot for it or not, that was their decision. That was the whole point of the exercise. And I remember having a conversation about a pretty well-known experimental economist, and he had been doing this for a number of years, and I was fairly new at it, and he offered me advice. He said, Jack, what you did was okay, but that's not how we economists do experiments. The way we do it is to assign values, induce values. Well, had I taken his advice, there was no point. My whole point was, how do people value assets? How do buyers value assets, and how do sellers value assets, and do they do it the same? So that would have destroyed the whole point of what I was up to on the thing. So, things to look out for there. The replication issue, I think, is getting more important. There is the whole thing in psychology that Echo referred to. It's a very, very serious issue. People are having trouble reproducing the results that other people have. And it isn't necessarily because of different cultures. They're trying to replicate it in the same culture, same place, and they're not replicating. So it's a real problem. Are people running experiments, and if you run enough experiments, and you have a 5% significance level, 5% of the things are going to show up as being significant, even if there is nothing is really going on, but 5% of them are going to fall outside the significant level, right? So replication is really an important issue. But the thing that I worry about is if you do a study that's a replication of somebody else's study, you have one devil of a time trying to get it published. The top journals don't want to publish replications. You send in a paper that's basically a replication, and they say, no, this has already been done. Yes, I know, that's the point. No, they say, no, we're looking for new ideas. This is an old idea. Well, think about it. The whole scientific method is based on the idea that people have to replicate. And if the journals won't publish replications, nobody's going to run replications, right? I think this is a serious problem. I mean, science depends on replication. And if you can't get published, nobody's going to do it, and we're not going to get the replications. No wonder we're going to get a bunch of rubbish out there because it's not been confirmed by other studies. I think it's a serious problem, and it's getting worse because the top journals, and it's difficult in any journal to get a replication published. And yeah, I don't know what to do about it. I see, we obviously sympathize with the journals. They've got a problem. But it undermines the whole idea of scientific inquiry, I think. There's another difference between economic experiments and psychology experiments. It's not only the payment issue, it's psychologists lie and economists don't. It's sort of a funny thing. when psychologists run experiments, they tell regularly, this is what's going on here, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and it's absolute lies. But the whole point is they're trying to get people to react to that scenario, but they pose it as the truth. Now afterwards, they'll tell them the truth. Economists, as far as I know, no economist that I know that runs experiments lies to the subjects.
It's taboo, so if you do these deceptions, it never get published.
That's right. And there's a good reason for it, because if you know that the guy, whatever the experimenter says might be a lie, then it's just going to undermine the whole system. So, and the word will get around. Other students will, on campus, if you're running students, oh, echo lies. Don't, he'll tell you this, this, and this. That's not how the thing is actually run. He says he's going to do this, but that doesn't happen. Well, that's going to undermine the next time he tries to run an experiment. Furthermore, people won't believe me either, because I'm another economist. So there's a big difference. Psychologists lie and economists don't lie. Well, those I guess are the main issue. Oh, there is the issue of, in part, it's a external validity issue. Are the results of experiments, do they predict actual behavior? And yay and nay, I think, is the answer to that one. I think there are some things that we can do in the lab, in the laboratory, that does predict behavior. But I think there are an awful lot of things that people do in laboratories which has very, very low chances of predicting real behavior. And I think we need to sort out things a bit better. I think people are making claims. They'll run a lab experiment and claim that this is, represents real behavior, when I think it's a pretty dubious claim on the thing. What I think a lot of people are concluding is that laboratory experiments, okay, they're good for certain things, but maybe not as many as we used to think. And what people are turning to are natural experiments or field experiments. Field experiments where you set up, well, that one about paying the teachers that I talked about yesterday, that would be a field experiment where you create the conditions of experiment, but these are just real teachers teaching real students and getting paid or not getting paid on the thing. And that's one way. And natural experiments are like the golf experiment, that these people were putting, this is their life, and you just look at the consequences of putting to save par or gain a birdie. So I think more and more people are looking to those kind of things. The problem is they're awfully hard to find. If you find a good situation where you can find, a natural experiment, that's great. But how many of these are we going to find? I mean, that's really tough. And those are natural experiments. Field experiments tend to be outrageously expensive. You have to really, like that one on the school teachers that I talked about. That was a pretty expensive operation, and most of them you have to, a lot of money is involved to do a proper field experiment. So even though that's sort of what, the best we can do, there are limitations. So life is tough in this in this business. Laboratory experiments, I think, have limited. It's, you know, laboratory experiments is a pretty artificial environment. And do people really, you know, reproduce the motives and so forth there? I don't know. You know, sometimes yay, sometimes nay on it. Well, let me take just about probably this much time to tell you about this study we did on surveys. Okay, as you've seen in the last 2 days, people run all kinds of surveys to test various things or whatever. You know, a lot of the, well, most of the things we've talked about in the last 2 days probably came out of survey studies of one sort or another. Now, surveys are many forms. The ones that tend to be used by behavioral economists tend to be things like classroom surveys. You have a class, you have a bunch of people out there, they're not going anywhere, so you give them a questionnaire and they answer the questions. And you collect them, and that's a survey. Very quick, very cheap, and so forth. And a lot of studies are done that way, based on those kinds of surveys. Other ones use the psych pools that Echo mentioned, that psychology departments in North America and Europe typically will require their students who take first and second year courses, lower level courses, to agree that they're going to be available to answer or to participate in experiments approved by the department. In other words, faculty people, staff people who want to run experiments get approval by the department. The department then says, okay, you're a student in this class, you take part in this experiment, and so forth. It's just standard procedure in most psych departments in North America, for example. It's pretty rare, I gather, for psych departments to do that in Asia. The one we tried to use psych labs in this study, and the universities that we looked at, even the ones with psychology departments, didn't have psych labs on the thing. So, but it is a common way to do it. Other way to do it now is the internet. What are the names of the big ones? Okay. What? Yeah, what's the one that everybody uses? The big one that has worldwide. Anyway, they're private. Anchor? MCERT. Okay, I obviously haven't done one of these myself, but you can contract with these, and what they do is to send out people sign up that they're part of this pool, and they sign up thousands of people, depending on the individual private firm that does it. Some of them are international, some of them are just regional, some of them are just national on the thing. But some of the big ones have pools that can, you know, all over the world. And what you can do is just contract and say, okay, I want 500 people from Chile, Argentina, wherever you want. And they'll send out questionnaires to these people, you know, whatever you want. And the people who subscribe to these things, then, you know, okay, I can make money by answering these surveys. So they get paid on the basis of the number of surveys they complete. And they've done surveys of these surveyors. What do people do who are answering these questionnaires? And one of them that I saw suggested, for example, that 60-some% of the people were watching television while they were answering. which really scared me. I mean, how can you answer a questionnaire if you're watching television, right? And so there are problems with it, and so forth. So anyway, the long and short of it, what we did was a friend of mine, a colleague in China and mainland China, and another one in Vietnam. What we decided to do was to check out the consistency of the responses using different kinds of questionnaires. So what we did was to pick out 5 different commonly used survey modes. Economic classrooms that I described, economic laboratories, the kind of thing that Eka was talking about, but they're often used for surveys as well. The internet, shopping mall. This is a common response to, okay, so many surveys are run using students as respondents. So people always ask the question, well, students are a lot different than real people, right? Normal people. They're younger. They're probably from families that are wealthier, and on average, they're certainly brighter than non-students, on average at least. So people worry about students not being typical of the general population. So one of the common responses is to run surveys in places like shopping malls. You just stop people, or they come to a table, and you give them a little gift of something, and then they answer your survey. And the last one was our attempt to duplicate the psych lab. What we ended up doing was basically using students that were in the classroom in first year psychology classes. They really weren't psych labs, but they replicated many of the features of a psych lab. Not all by any means. The one that we've used a lot, that we didn't use here, were telephone surveys. And the reason is that people just don't answer telephone surveys anymore. And they just, boom, they won't answer. So the ones you get are not necessarily representative of the population that you think you're surveying. So we didn't try to use telephone at all. A lot of the earlier stuff was based on telephone things. So what we did, and we did the same thing in Vietnam and in mainland China, we used 5 questions that were common to all of the surveys. The first question asked about, do people use the same discount rate for future gains as future losses? We had 2 versions of each question. One asked for the discount rate, and I won't give you the whole question. I've got the paper here if you're interested. One version of question 1 asked about the discount rate for future gains. The other version asked about the discount rate for future losses. And then that allowed us to compare the 2 to see whether they were the same or not. The second question was, the first one is a common question asked in a lot of behavioral studies. The second one was something that we came up with on our own. Nobody else has ever tried this. You have a certain amount of money and you're going to share it with another person. One version was, how much do you give to the other person? The other version was, how much do you keep for yourself? So, it's the same thing, but worded differently. Does that result in differences in the amount of money that people give to the other person? And this is the one I talked about yesterday. Is it fair to raise the rent as a result of increases in cost? Is it fair to increase the rent as a result of scarcity of rental housing? This one was a risk-seeking, risk aversion, risk-seeking. This is a famous paper question that Kahneman and Tversky did, the so-called Asian flu question. And what it was, they said, there's going to be an epidemic of Asian flu. We changed the question, by the way, to African disease because we were running it in Asia, right? But that was the only change we made to the thing. There's going to be an outbreak of Asian flu. It's going to kill 600 people. And one version asked, there are two treatments programs. One would save this many people. The other, there's a probability of this many people and so forth. It had the same expected value. But it was saving people. The other version was there are two treatment programs, and it will allow this many people will die as a result of this, and this many people will die. So it's people will die, people will be saved. It's a very famous, in the literature, it's a very famous question. And the last one was a trust question. There is a sort of a standard way of asking about trust. And what we did was two versions of the trust question. So we had the same question in all 5 versions, and we ran it in the way that that survey would be run. In other words, the classroom survey was done in a classroom using students in the classroom. You know. And the people in the mall survey was done. They were done in shopping malls with people who were in the shopping mall, and so forth. In other words, we used the respondents that you would normally expect to find for that kind of a survey, and we contracted with the internet companies. So what we were interested in is, are the results you get roughly the same depending on for the different surveys? Because we were concerned about this. We thought it was an interesting question because people don't really look at anything other than convenience and cost, basically. Which one's cheaper and which one's more convenient? And that's really the criteria that we, because I do the same thing, use. And nobody really looks at the question, well, is this kind of a survey any good for this kind of a thing I'm interested in? That isn't really something people talk about or even think about very much. Furthermore, we couldn't find very many comparisons in the literature. There were a couple, but not really anything like this. Not 5 questions and 5 different surveys and 2 different countries. Nobody had done this, and which surprised us a bit. So we decided, well, that was a pretty easy thing to sort of figure out and might be interesting. So we did, and basically we were amazed at the results. We looked, for example, and just to summarize it, well, the first thing we looked at is just the numbers. Are we getting the same percentage going for, on the interest rate question, for example, are there differences in the numbers? And the answer to that was yes, big differences in numbers. Proportions saying yes or no to which side, very big. But that's not as important, of course, as the conclusions that the evidence points to. So what we did was to compare the conclusions to each question in one survey versus one other survey. So for example, we would take the classroom survey and the internet survey to question 1. What was the conclusion of the survey in the classroom, and what was the conclusion in the survey of the other in the internet? And we would compare them. Are they comparable, or are they significantly different? So that was our really big test. What we found was pretty much a disaster. In China, these are the China ones and these are the Vietnam ones. In China, 54% of the pairs reached significantly different conclusions, over half. In Vietnam, a little better, but not a whole lot better. Roughly half of the conclusions differed when you compared one to one other survey. I mean, we were astounded. We just were floored with that kind of a difference. So our conclusion of our survey, or of our study, was two things. One, maybe we ought not to be as cavalier about just picking a survey. Maybe we ought to, think about this a little bit more to see whether this kind of a survey makes sense for whatever we're doing. And the second thing was, somebody else better do a survey or do a study like the one we just did to see whether what we found is general or not. And I really do think that needs to be done. That somebody else better do something like this to see whether we just got a bad draw or we messed up or is this real? If it's real, I think we've got a little problem. That, it matters which kind of a survey. The other thing that unfortunately also came out, there wasn't really one survey that was consistently better than another. In fact, there's really, they're all pretty bad. If you look at, for example, the classroom actually is as good as any others. But only 7 out of 20, there were 20 comparisons in each case here. 7 of them were significantly different, which is pretty good, but in China it was 9. And, them all 8 in Vietnam, but 13 in China. So, you really can't say one is much better than the other, I don't think. So it was we just finished the thing. We submitted it to one journal, and it was turned down. And mostly on reasons of the way the thing was written, and also making, not a very good reason other than the writing of the thing not clear and that sort of thing. So we're about to resubmit it to another journal on the thing. But anyway, that's sort of the results of that study. And as I said, we were very, very surprised at it. And also, it's kind of bad news in terms of doing research. That when we rely on the kind of surveys that we all rely on, we may or may not get a good answer, and that's a little unsettling. So, anyway. Any comments, questions? Anybody have an answer?
Yeah. What do you mean by the difference between?
Okay. For example, the classroom survey may have shown that people use a higher rate to discount future gains than they use to discount future losses. Another survey may find no difference between them. So there was a different conclusion.
Oh, so you wrong 20 surveys, 20 for class?
Yeah, there were 5 surveys and 5 questions. So classroom was compared for each question. The classroom was compared to the lab, the classroom was compared to the internet, and so forth. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 20 paired comparisons. And in roughly half of all those, the conclusion reached in one differed from the conclusion reached in the other. So, you know, if you run one survey and you see the people use a higher rate to discount future gains and future losses, another survey might say there's no difference. And in fact, one of the surveys said they use a higher rate for the losses than they did for the gains. The opposite conclusion. That was the problem. So, you know, what do we have to do? Run 3 different surveys to make sure that we've got something? I don't know. It's just it's one of those things. It's bad news. It's going to be interesting also to see if we get this published. I think people ought to know about this. Even if we're wrong, at least, you know, we're cautioning, and maybe it'll encourage somebody else to run another one to see whether it's as bad as we think it is, as we show it is. Yeah.
I just wonder, because you choose a different survey mode, and the people chosen from the different mode maybe have a different characteristics.
Yeah.
So those characteristics may affect your result are different. So if you try to test the mode, survey mode, then you probably should fix the subject's characteristics. That would probably be easier.
This was exactly the point raised by the editor, but I think that it's not valid, because what we were testing is, when you run a classroom survey, students are the people you get when you run a classroom survey. So we didn't bring in shoppers from the malls into the classroom. We used the classroom with the people you would expect to find in a classroom, because that's the way we run them. Compare that to who you get when you go to the mall.
The question I raised yesterday, because I really doubt the experiment exam since I read the article before, 10 years ago actually. I think it used a very small amount of subjects, and especially you use the students, they have very similar characteristics. People are different, can have a different perception about things.
No, what we're interested in is the results you get if you just run a classroom survey. Compare that to the results you get if you use the internet. The internet gets these kind of respondents, classroom gets this kind of respondents. Can you say that, you know, you get the same result or you get a different result? That's all.
I'm happy you do this paper, because you answer my questions. Because my question is, I always doubt. You use a different subject,
yeah,
give a different result. But yesterday, the other lecturer told me, no, the average are the same, but that doesn't convince me. The 10 years doesn't convince me. Now, even 2 days lecture, I'm still not convinced by the very small amount of people. I think the development of behavior science, behavior economics, and experimental economics, very, very encouraging, very interesting, and exciting. But the methodology still doesn't convince me that much since 10 years ago.
You're probably in a majority of economists, actually, but it's changing. It's changing. No, I think we use roughly the same, sample size in both China and different ones, and in China and Vietnam, kind of thing. And there were quite a few differences, by the way, between China when we compared the results in China versus Vietnam. There were quite a few differences as well. Now, whether that was due to the fact that Chinese people and Vietnamese people are different, or different, just that random differences between the surveys, I don't know. We can't tell, of course. But
when I travel in China and Vietnam, I found that these two countries are communist countries. I was the kind of person very direct and blank, very direct. So sometimes people will have a face turn white because I say something maybe taboo to them. So I think if you choose a subject from different survey modes, then people probably have a different alertness. Because I went to visit some people, many people, professors and students, PhD students or master students in China. I found that they are very cautious in terms of their what they speak and what they express. They are really cautious. And then one time I went to Vietnam and they told me I went Vietnam and go with a group of people. They doing origami. They do origami in a very, very remote countryside. I asked why. They told me because the government doesn't like the people to get together. Even they are just doing origami, they probably think they are rebellious group. They get the trouble. So they go to very, very small countryside to do the origami. Yeah. So I think if you want to try this one, maybe next time you can try Western countries, very free country like Canada. To see if the result is the same.
That was my conclusion. That we're hoping other people will now try to replicate ours, or do what we did in different countries. And I agree with you. This ought to be done all over to see whether it's as bad as we're finding, or is this unique to Asia?
I guess.
If it is, I mean that's an interesting thing too, by the way.
I guess what she says, I think I can see it also here. Like for example, internet and mall and class, these three different locations. There are several things that differ. One is, of course, the subject pools. Those who come to class, those who come to the mall, they are not different. They are not the same.
That's right.
Okay, and then there's another thing that differ. So if you are in the internet, you are not being observed by the experimenter. But if you are in the class, you are being observed by the experimenter. Okay, if you are in the mall, you are in the public space. So this is another element that differ. Yeah. So probably because of all these things, the potential different things that make them differ, you cannot really tease out whether it is actually because of the subject pool or whether it is actually because of the method of conducting the...
I agree, but what people are doing, they're running a classroom experiment and they're reporting the result, and they say people discount the rate future gains at a higher rate than future losses. And then somebody else does another study using, the psych pool, and they say the results shows that people use a higher rate than the opposite. That's what we're interested in. Can you generalize any result, like these 5 questions, using any one of these different surveys? And it looks like no. That half the time you're going to get a different result because you used a different pool, different mode. And people, as far as I know, are not aware of that. I certainly wasn't aware of it. But it makes the choice of the mode pretty critical. But also you can't sort of find much consistency. So, if you're in China, the best thing you can do is use a classroom. In Vietnam, the best thing you can do is use something else. So, what do you do, Coach?